Recent work suggests that there is a powerful new way to think about turbulence. In this way of thinking, turbulence fleetingly but repeatedly mimics special flows called exact coherent structures. However, there is scanty experimental work backing this theory in 3D flows. In this talk, I will present the first experimental evidence for the dynamical relevance of exact coherent structures in 3D flow. As I just mentioned, the ultimate aim of this research is to test the dynamical relevance of exact coherent structures, or ECS, in an experimental 3D turbulent flow. To do this, we need to compare invariant solutions to the Navier-Stokes equation, which have been computed in numerics, with turbulent velocity fields obtained from measurement. Previous studies on this, carried out in 3D, have focused on time-independent ECS, which periodic orbit theory suggests are not dynamically relevant. Additionally, these studies have compared open flows with ECS computed in periodic domains, and typically small periodic domains. Furthermore, the measurements in these studies were also carried out in a way that required Taylor's frozen turbulence approximation to make comparisons to the 3D ECS. We avoid all of these challenges by working in the Taylor-Couette geometry. Taylor-Couette flow is defined as the flow between two independently rotating concentric cylinders. The fluid is held in the gap by top and bottom end caps that, in our experiment, rotate with the outer cylinder. There are four dimensional parameters that define the system. Two of them describe the geometry. Here we use the radius ratio and the height of the fluid column to the annular gap width. Similarly, there are two that describe the driving. We're using the Reynolds numbers that correspond to the inner and outer cylinders' wall velocities. We're working in the counter-rotating regime of Taylor-Couette, which means that there is shear present in the flow. However, it is still largely a centrifugally driven flow. The geometry is a closed flow, which allows us to both make measurements and compute ECS in the full flow domain. We have on hand 7 ECS computed in our system at the Reynolds number we are studying. These solutions are all relative periodic orbits, or RPOs. A relative periodic orbit is a flow that periodically repeats itself, but as it does this, it drifts along the direction of continuous symmetry, which in our case is along the azimuthal direction. After a full period, the solution has drifted by an amount phi. On the left is a table that gives periods and drift angles for the RPOs we've computed. Now that we have solutions in hand, we might want to know, does the turbulence ever resemble these ECS? We can do this by defining a distance metric, which is just the L2 norm of the difference between the turbulent flow field and the ECS. This distance is also minimized with respect to time along the period, as well as orientation along the azimuth. Here's an example of the distance metric from turbulence computed in numerics with RPO1. What we are looking for in a plot like this is not only a deep minima, which implies that the turbulence resembles the ECS, but also a wide one. This implies that not only were the two similar, but they were similar for an extended duration of time. If the RPO and the turbulence look similar for an extended duration of time, it is likely that they are dynamically mimicking or shadowing each other. Here is an example of a candidate minimum that may be an example of shadowing. To gain further insight, let's look at what's going on in the actual flow. On the top is a snapshot from the numerically computed turbulent record, and below is the ECS corresponding to the closest point along the RPO. What you're looking at are contours of the velocity field in the radial direction. The same contours were used on both the top and bottom figures. Notice how similar these figures look. This sort of analysis shows that instantaneously the flows resembled each other, but it doesn't tell us anything about the dynamics. To probe the dynamical relevance of this ECS, we need a slightly different metric. One way to do this is to consider the distance metric we already introduced, but instead of minimizing time along the period, we allowed it to vary as a function of both time along the turbulence, t, as well as time along the period of the RPO, tau. If we then plotted this temporal shadowing metric as a heat map where each point on the map represented the distance for that given t and tau, what we would expect is that if the two flows were evolving at the same rate, the minimum distance between them would fall along diagonal lines. Similarly, if we did the same sort of analysis, but instead of looking for minimum along tau, we looked at minimum in phi, the azimuthal phase between them, if they were drifting at the same rate, we would expect that the phase offset between them would be constant. At the end of the period of the RPO would reset and shift by an amount phi given in the table on the previous slide. This means that we would expect a staircase pattern of the minimum. The staircase might be going upstairs or downstairs depending on the specifics of the RPO. If we look at examples from numerically computed turbulence compared with RPO1, we do find occasions that have this signature. That is, minimum that lie along the diagonal of a temporal shadowing diagram and a staircase pattern along the drift diagram. Now that we know the signatures we are looking for, let's turn to the experimental flow. Our Taylor-Couette setup is made of transparent walls, which allows for complete optical access. The cell is submerged in a temperature bath. Both the working fluid as well as the cooling fluid are index matched to the walls to remove optical distortions from the curved walls. In the experiments presented here, we shine a laser sheet at a single plane perpendicular to the axis of rotation. The height of this plane is precisely controlled. We then image from beneath and perform planar PIV. We acquire velocity information along the plane in nearly the full azimuthal domain. The missing portions are due to shadows in the illumination. The velocity information obtained is only the velocity components in plane. That is, the data is in 2 dimensions and only has 2 components of velocity, or 2D, 2C. Due to the confinement of our system from the top and bottom end caps, 2D, 2C measurements are actually sufficient to establish dynamical relevance. This can be seen by comparing shadowing diagrams from the full 3D, 3C with those from 2D, 2C. On the top is a temporal shadowing diagram computed in numerics with all 3 components of velocity in the full 3D domain. On the bottom is the same data except computed only using 2 components of velocity confined to a single plane. Notice that qualitatively all of the information we are interested in is captured. That is, minimum clearly lie along diagonal lines in both plots. Turning this analysis to just a small amount of our experimental data revealed occasions with the same signature. What you're looking at here is experimentally obtained turbulence compared with RPO1. In the top left, you see the experimental data. The top right, you see RPO1 at its closest configuration to the experiment. Beneath it, you find both the temporal and the drift shadowing metrics. Notice that the shadowing metrics have the signatures that we're looking for. The temporal metric has clear minima along a diagonal, and the drift metric has a downward trending staircase pattern of plateaus. Notice that when the minima are clearly defined, both the experiment and the RPO resemble each other closely, as does its temporal behavior. To summarize, the aim of this research was to establish the dynamical relevance of exact coherent structures in real 3D turbulent flows. We did this by working in the Taylor-Couette geometry, which allowed us to make measurements without approximation that we could compare to the real 3D flow. By doing this, we found the first experimental evidence for the dynamical relevance of exact coherent structures in real 3D flows.